Is to keep you safe, always. This companion is all in your interest. Baroda Home Loans that come with low interest rates, long tenure, accidental cover, and a lot more. Bank of Baroda, India's international bank.
So we have a 5-minute buffer. Let me start the session and let you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 12th Z Jaipur Literature Festival's Charbagh. We are delighted to introduce session number 88, Trust. This session is brought to you by Bank of Baroda. We have with us the author of Trust, Creating the Foundation for Entrepreneurship in Developing Countries, entrepreneur and Harvard Business School professor Tarun Khanna. We also have Professor of Finance at Harvard Business School and Professor at Harvard Law School, author of The Wisdom of Finance, Mr. Desai. They are in conversation with entrepreneur and investor Mohit Satyanand, chairperson of Altico Capital India, Naina Lal Kidwai, and writer and brand expert Ambi Parmeswaran. Please join me in welcoming them with a round of applause.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me in the back? Yeah, wonderful. It's my pleasure to welcome this extremely distinguished panel on this dais. We have two Harvard professors. We have Naina Lal, who's been an icon of the... Also, yes, she reminded me, she was a Harvard Business School grad and also a very dear old friend and an icon of the banking industry. She was chairperson of HSBC in India. Okay, she says she was chairman. And Ambi Parmeswaran, who has steered many iconic campaigns in India. Three of these gentlemen have books which have come out very recently. Tarun's book, which is on trust, becomes sort of the anchor for this discussion. Mihir has written a fascinating book on finance. And how it's actually central to our lives, but something that we possibly don't understand. And he's tried to trace the relationship of finance with ideas as different as romance, olive oil, and of course, greed. And Ambi has a book called Sponge, which is about learning from your customers. Particularly with context to advertising, which is the field he's worked in. But let's start with Tarun's book and this central concept of trust. And he's studying developing countries like India and saying that we have to take for granted the fact that these are trust deficit societies. And without asking where that trust deficit comes from, an entrepreneur can't say that because there is a deficit of trust in my nation, it's going to be difficult for me to build up a business. Rather, it's not enough for me just to create. I've got to create the conditions in which to create. Does that sum up the starting point of your book well, Tarun? Okay, great. First time ever I've got a thumbs up from a Harvard prof. So Tarun, in that context, I'd like you to start by telling us something about the SKS story and how the entrepreneurs decided, in order to create this trust, that they would sit their business, as it were, on top of existing circles of trust, which is the women and the communities that those women represented, and how the business shaped.
Great, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here with so many friends in the audience and here. That's a good story to start with. SKS has been, since the time of writing the book, has been renamed with the acronym BFIL, Bharat Financial Inclusion Limited, but it's essentially a microfinance firm. Most of you would have heard of organized microfinance, and I think the central construct that we're starting with is the idea that one of the things that an entrepreneur would consider doing in a trust deficit society is building an organization atop existing societal structures of trust that already exist in pockets. So for instance, we're not very far from many villages in any part of India. And if you go around, you'll see pockets of people who have learned over the decades, maybe even centuries, to trust each other. And I think one of the incredible things about organized microfinance is that it's learned that it can leverage this for its own purposes. In finance, my colleague Mihir is the finance professor in our university. So I'll steal a little bit of his words. We often say that that there are two central economic problems in finance, in financing, something called the adverse selection problem and the moral hazard problem. I won't go into the details, but it's about who do you trust, and once you trust them, how do you make sure that they follow through on that trust? To put it in layman's terms, that's really the adverse selection and moral hazard problem. And what microfinance is doing is saying, look, as an outside provider of finance to, let's say, the stereotypical poor woman in a village who needs capital to start an honest business, we have no means to ascertain whom we can trust because we're coming from the outside, and we have no means to enforce that once we lend her the money that we will be able to get it back in an ethical fashion. So let's not worry about it. Let's go in and free ride on the existing village structures of trust and build something on top of it. So there are 2 or 3 central points that, if I may, I use that example to communicate. One is, of course, this idea that there are pre-existing pockets of trust that we should be astute enough to leverage in some way rather than trying to create a new, which is much harder. And the second is that technology is almost never, in my view, and this might be a controversial point of view to some people in the audience, technology, in my view, is almost never the answer to cultivating trust. It's an instrument through which you can do something, but it's almost never the answer. To go back to my roots as an applied math person, I might say it's neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition to create trust. But let me stop with that and see if we can carry on the conversation.
So what happened with SKS? Because there's another story there also, which is about the breakdown of trust.
Yeah, so many of you will know the story. It's a hugely controversial company in some ways. I've been one of the main directors on it for a very long time. I still am. Essentially, the company grew extremely fast, run by a very charismatic founder, and did an IPO. The IPO was incredibly successful, and this is going to turn out to be a point of connection to Mihir's work in just a few moments. The IPO was incredibly successful. Some people got very rich, not me, it must be said, and that must have rubbed some other people the wrong way. And triggered some mistrust, shall we say, in the issue of the common parlance. This is a topic that I treat at great length in the book. But the long and short is, at least my subjective view of the entire ringside experience was that the trust that had been built up over decades by the women in the villages, and that had then been shepherded and stewarded by organized microfinance, not just the company I was affiliated with, but by many others, over another decade or so, was in an instant lost through the shenanigans of someone else, right? In this case, I believe unscrupulous media and unscrupulous politicians. And there was not much that one could do about it, except, and this is a baptism of fire for those of us in senior management and on the board of the company, we had to then endure much agonizing distress, threats, litigation threats, personal violence, arrests, all sorts of things, for the next 3 or 4 years while we tried to piecemeal reconstruct that edifice of trust. And I think there are lots of lessons there, which is you build trust slowly, but particularly in what you referred to as a trust deficit society at the outset, which is true not just in India, but in most developing countries. It's very easy to destroy that edifice of trust, much easier certainly than building it over time. Yeah.
Thanks, Tarun. So there were really 2 parts of this story of the destruction of trust, as you said. One was the politicians who had been instrumental in providing finance in some way, and here was a much more efficient organization.
Yes,
in some way. Exactly. And here was a much more efficient organization delivering it, and so this took over from their political power and reduced it. So this was an opportunity for them to leap in. But then there was also the public mistrust, the fact that this company, which in everybody's eyes was providing the social service of finance at a relatively low cost, suddenly had a very rich founder and other board members. And this capitalized on a widespread feeling of mistrust towards finance, which is, of course, the topic of your book. So where does this come from, this widespread mistrust of finance?
Well, in some sense, distrust of finance is age-old. So we know that lending has been characterized as a nefarious activity for millennia. Unfortunately, historically, people understood both the dark side of finance, but also the very positive side of finance, which as an enabling device for people who don't have resources. And so, unfortunately, what's happened recently is that finance has suffered in a way that, in some part to its own doing, a significant trust deficit. It's hard to think of an industry with a greater trust deficit than finance, in fact. And 10 years after the financial crisis, we have yet to really restore that trust deficit. What I try to do in my book is try to suggest there are a couple of ways out of that. The first is we have to stop talking as if finance is God's work, and we have to accept the responsibility that there is a lot of value extraction going on in finance as opposed to value creation. We tend to exalt finance in a way that I don't think is proportionate to what it does. The second thing is we have to demystify it. I think what people in finance tend to do is intimidate people because that gives them power. But as a consequence of that, people distrust finance in that way. And then the final thing to do is to try to rehumanize finance, which is what has happened to finance in the last 50 years is, in some sense, very elegant intellectually, which is it's become more of a science. But in that process, we've lost sense of who the people are who are affected by financial decisions. So people look at spreadsheets and they look at screens all day and they don't really think through what the consequences of those decisions are. So in my book, I try to just trace through the humanistic ideas that actually underlie much of finance as a way to try to recover that. On Tarun's points, I think he's exactly right that ultimately this is all about information, right? And in these trust deficit situations, it is about increasing information flows that can actually permit trust to develop. And in that sense, Tarun, I think I'm a little more optimistic about technology than you might be, in the sense that the fintech promise is one where the larger institutions which have monopolized finance are disrupted by people who can actually make information more transparent and actually create the circles of trust outside of these large behemoth institutions that have come to dominate the financial landscape. So in that sense, I think fintech is actually quite promising for the problem of trust in finance and frankly, the problem of trust in commerce, more generally.
Thanks, Mihir. Naina is somebody who's been a practitioner of finance for the bulk of your adult life. How does the finance industry in India deal with the task of restoring and building trust?
So I'm not sure whether I want to run away or stay here as the sole practitioner of someone who's actually been lending money. Let me just say that fundamental to any relationship of a lender, a borrower, is trust. And the mistrust runs very high in terms of whether I look at the private equity business, which I work in today, or the role as an erstwhile banker, in that in the world of private equity today, I'm really struck by how often there will be a forensic audit before you actually put money as equity or risk capital into a company.
Forensic is a horrible word. I associate it with crime. So can you list?
So a forensic audit will be to get specialist auditors that go into audit for fraud. So your starting point often, before you invest equity in a mid-sized company, which is where the private equity world operates, and it's probably the same in venture capital, is a forensic audit. Let me make sure that these guys are really what they say they are. Let me make sure that the rumors around what they ferret away is not true. Let me make sure that they don't have child labor. So at every level, the starting point is almost that of mistrust, and therefore you need this big endorsement of these guys are kosher, I can put money in. But the other side of it, and I would like to call it responsible finance, and I talk about it in my book, Survive or Sink, from a green finance angle, is we as financiers, and India's been really bad on this score, do not have a norm to which we will not lend. So as a foreign banker, I had a norm which I had to follow that was a global norm. I will not lend to polluting industries. I will not lend to certain types of mining activities that destroy environment, etc. There is no India norm. And I think we in the world of finance must have a norm as much as what we will lend to as what we should not lend to. Because as India embarks on building its infrastructure, 80% of India's infrastructure is yet to be built between now and 2030. How we build it is going to be about the world of responsible finance. And to everything that Tarun's amazing book talks about, I think that fundamental level of trust, the self-help group, the women that stand for each other as you lend to them, is equally for us in the world of finance to ensure that we don't mess up the trust that they put in us by charging them a rapacious rate of interest, by not helping them with livelihoods and the ability to repay. So that relationship must lie at both ends.
You know, I'm going to pick up on this word that you used, rapacious, because this is something that Tarun talks about, which is rapacious is relative. It's very easy to say that SKS is lending at 20%, and to somebody sitting in Delhi who's used to borrowing at 14 or 15%, it can be portrayed as being rapacious. But they're lending in an environment where they've been, where their customers have been borrowing at 40 and 80 and 100%. 500%. Your mic would help.
500%.
Right, right. So how is this misperception best tackled?
First, I should say I'm very proud of my colleagues at what was SKS and BFIL for the way that they brought back trust, really all the way. And I'm very proud of it. It took 5 years, 6 years to do, 8 years now. And today, the interest rate that they charge to women is absolutely the lowest in the world, bar none, including all the very celebrated examples that you hear about from Bangladesh, you hear about from Bolivia, Peru, South Africa, East Africa, bar none. So it's an incredible story. I think it goes back to the transparency idea, which is if people knew what the cost of delivering the service of providing tiny loans was to individual women about whom you have no information whatsoever and no legal recourse to repossess the capital that you are duty-bound to repossess for your investors, you would laugh at how low 19% is. The only way that you can get to 19% is by draconian commitment to efficiency.
Which means that as an organization, you have to take on the communication task, not just of communicating to your customers, which is what we normally see as central in business, but also of communicating to a much larger and wider constituency.
We failed. I failed. I'm an important part of the leadership team, so I failed in that task. Presuming that the facts on the ground would trump.
Bad word, but it's allowed.
I had to do it. I had to do it once. Would trump any negative rhetoric. And I think the empirical reality is that that's not the case, that there are enough people out there. I was going to use the word gullible. I don't mean it in a negative way, but maybe less exposed to the realities of the world, who would believe a story when they're sold a bill of goods.
I want to go to Ambi now. And one of the examples that you talk about in your book is Amul. And it's a discussion which we were having with Ambi earlier. Amul have been extraordinarily successful at reaching out to a wider community in building that organization, not just to the milk suppliers, but to the community at large. Can you shed some light on the success of their communication story?
So I think Tarun's book and my book kind of come together in our words of praise for GCMMF, Gujarat Cooperative Milk Marketing Federation, Amul, which is a brand which my erstwhile agency, FCB Ulka, has the association with for more than 25 odd years. So we talked about trust deficit. And I think in Amul, and especially in Dr. Verghese Kurian, we saw someone who has an excessive positive trust with his people. The way he dealt of course, with the milk farmers, dairy farmers, the way he dealt with an agency, and the kind of trust he reposed in the agency. And I talk about a little story in my book where every year in the month of March, the agency is called and the agency is told to present the next year's plans. And Dr. Kurian is in the room and another 10 different managers are there. And the agency presents the full year's plan. And apparently in that particular meeting, one youngster put up his hand and said, look, Dr. Kurian, I have a point to make. So Dr. Kurian says, what is it? So he says, sir, you know, this ad the agency has presented, you know, they put a blue color. You know, it should be in green, you know. They shouldn't do it in blue, should do it in green. And Dr. Kurian then tells a story that, look, young man, you hire an architect to build a house for you. And the architect comes and the building design has 5 pillars. And you tell the architect, I don't like 5 pillars. You know, I'll remove 3 pillars. You know, I want the design with 2 pillars. And the architect removes 3 pillars and you build a house with 2 pillars. And a year later, the house collapses. Whom do you blame? Do you blame yourself? You blame the architects. You hired these agencies to do work for you. If they recommended something, if you have issues, point out the issue, tell them not to make a change. Don't tell them to change from blue to green or green to yellow. As an extent, that, for example, I mean, agency called Dakuna works on their, you know, billboards.
The topical ads.
Yeah. You know, that's the only example probably in the world where the agency is given the freedom to create the ad and put it out into media, and the client sees it after it comes out in media. I mean, look at the amount of trust, you know, Dr. Kurian, and now, you know, Mr. Sodhi and the whole generation just passed down, has in the client agency system. In most other clients, the agency has to go through 5 rounds of nerve-wracking meetings before you get one ad through. Here, this agency gets ads out every 3 days, you know, and it goes up. They make mistakes, which is fine, but it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the service delivery person. Saying, look, whatever I present, the client is going to approve. So therefore, I better make sure I present really good stuff. So I think that whole organization created a huge sense of positive trust with everyone they dealt with. I mean, we were lucky. We got, got a benefit out of this trust. And of course, I think same thing goes to the way they deal with their dairy farmers, the way they deal with other associates. So I think you talked about it.
Sure.
From the dairy farmer point of view, I've spoken about it from the marketing,
from the
the
communication point of view. Yeah. I want to go back to finance. Mihir, you talked about, in your book, as well as in a conversation we just had, you talked about how in 2008, in the financial crisis, it was sort of pitched as Main Street versus Wall Street.
Right.
And in the end, it was Wall Street that won, and not Main Street. And that destroyed the trust in the finance industry. What was the role that the government should have played over there? And
yeah, so I mean, we're 10 years in from the financial crisis, and I really think people don't appreciate how much of the political dynamics today in the US, in the UK, all around the world are associated with the fallout from that financial crisis, and in some ways the mishandling of it. So I think the first thing that didn't happen was there was no clear sense of responsibility that was allocated to private actors. You know, said more fancily, that there's nobody who got punished in any meaningful way for what happened. Not even fired, really. And so I think the first mistake that the government made was to take it quite easy on the practitioners in one way. I think the second thing that happened that was problematic is these institutions, if anything, grew larger. And we didn't really learn the lesson, which is that large financial institutions are problematic just by their nature. And without stronger regulation, they continue to be problematic.
Too big
today.
to fail.
Too big to fail. But this point about the government, I think, is important, and it relates to Tarun's book, I think, in an interesting way, because I think Tarun is very pragmatic in emphasizing the micro foundations of trust. And he takes as a given that the institutional background is problematic. But I do think it's worth emphasizing that, in a way, trust is a second best solution, right? I mean, when enterprise grows large, we need the institutional background and we need the contractual enforcement that facilitates commerce. I mean, to your point, Naina, why are people doing forensic audits? They're doing forensic audits because they know once they put their capital in, the recourse through courts or otherwise is limited. And
well, actually, I would go one step back, Mihir. It's because they know that the investigating agencies are not doing their job.
Well, fair enough.
Yeah.
But so this is, I think, what's tough about this trust topic, which is obviously trust is fantastic, but in a way, our reliance on it represents a failure. It represents a failure of the institutions that should be promoting this in a more neutral way.
Yes.
Naina, would you like to say something about that?
Well, I was just going to, touch on where Tarun's space on entrepreneurs and trust and finance, and the distinction that needs to be made between a willful defaulter and one who, because the nature of business and risk is such that businesses fail, and how we deal with that. And I think I envy the US because of its own bankruptcy laws and the way it allows an entrepreneur to move on and try and start again, as against being under a perennial blacklist of not being able to recover. So I think this is a very fundamental part of trust. The trust you place in the entrepreneur to get it right, and he fails, and frankly in India, much of business fails because of regulatory mishaps. A government that commits it will supply coal and then cancels coal supply. And lo and behold, half the power sector goes belly up because what was key for its delivery, the coal contracts, have disappeared. So who is responsible? Government created the mess, then government goes after those same guys who failed, and they're then put in a box. And before you know it, the bankers who lent to them, because they actually saw that company as being okay because there were government contracts underwriting it, are also behind bars. So there's the whole failure or ecosystem, which also needs to be looked at. And at the base of it has to be that the entrepreneur who's right, who's gone in and created a business with his or her own risk capital, must also be given our trust to the extent that he or she had a desire to repay, but was not able to because the rules were changed on him or her.
But this willful defaulter got a minister into trouble.
Sorry?
A minister labeled someone who is absconding as a willful defaulter, and that, that got him into trouble.
That's okay.
Yeah. Tarun, you want
if he was a willful defaulter, he deserves to be called a willful defaulter.
Yeah, but
in the US,
but that goes. But in
US,
terms of the popular dialogue, and this goes to your point, there's no distinction. That if someone has defaulted, then he is, at essence, somebody who's corrupt. Whereas underlining the fact that failure is a part of business and it can create defaults, and therefore being able to distinguish between a willful defaulter and a defaulter goes really to the popular narrative around finance and business.
And in fact, I mean, this is one of the hardest problems in finance, which is, again, the information problem, which is who is a willful defaulter and who's defaulting because of bad luck. You can strain your imagination. In the US, we have somebody who willfully defaulted many times and then became president.
He's now the president, right?
Right. Tarun, you wanted to say something about
I wanted
governance
to pick up on this last thread of conversation about the sort of micro environment within which an individual creative person tries to foster trust. And the macro institutional environment where trust is wanting in general in developing countries. But one of the central questions I was trying to confront in my book is, we are all living in developing countries. My work is in a developing country, even though my adopted home is in Boston. And the question I ask myself is, who is going to do this? These institutions didn't just materialize out of thin air. Even the institutions that we pride ourselves on in some parts of the world, right? Naina just said, I envy the US. Well, those were the creations of entrepreneurs, of policy entrepreneurs, of individual entrepreneurs at some point who cultivated trust in the micro sense, which then aggregated, right? So the sort of rhetorical question, but a serious question that I was asking my readers and myself as an academic and intellectual is, who is going to build the institutions that foster trust so that the developing countries can get out of this Sisyphean task of trying to do things in a miasma of mistrust? And the answer is, it's you and me. It's ultimately us as a putative entrepreneur who has to build that trust, which is why I go back to the phrase that may be too cute for some, but that says in the book that it's not just your task and responsibility to create something as an entrepreneur, but it's also to create the conditions to create. The criticism that the multilateral institutions have leveled at me for saying that is, wow, you're making the task of the entrepreneur seem so much harder. I have news for you, it is harder. That's why it's a developing country. But it doesn't make it any less of the best among bad choices to say that it is our responsibility and in our interest at the end of the day, both material interest and social interest, to recognize that we are operating in a trust deficit and that part of our task as creative people is to do something about that in our immediate circumstances, leaving open the sort of almost intractable problem of how this aggregates over the efforts of a lot of people so that we create institutions that then make it easier for the generations to come.
So Tarun, before I go on to take questions from the audience, I just want you to reflect a little bit, and I'd like you to come in on this as well, Naina, which is that in this attempt to create organizations that fostered trust and created institutions such as the SEC and so on, there would have been a very healthy exchange between practitioners and government. They couldn't have been built just by bureaucracy. Can you just dwell briefly on that?
It's a fabulous point that you're bringing up. I don't treat it sufficiently in the book, which is at the end of the day a very short book. But there is a chapter on government, and what I do is I contrast two very interesting programs. One is our good friend Nandan's Aadhaar attempt in this country with something called conditional cash transfer, which rolled out across Latin America. In Brazil, in particular, it took the form of something called Bolsa Familia. A conditional cash transfer is just that, to put it simply, the state agrees to give a family some money conditional on its doing some basic good things for the child, like putting her in school, vaccinating her, etc. And the idea is that that propels you out of the deepest depths of poverty into something more subsistence. But I use the comparison of the examples to show, to illustrate your point, which is that unless there is a symbiosis of minds, right, and pas de deux, if you will, between the state and the private sector, you're not going to have the rich, fertile information exchange to be able to co-create these institutions that will ultimately foster trust.
Naina, how good is our government as that? At creating this pas de deux, this dance between the entrepreneur and the government?
So at least the desire to create an ecosystem for a thriving entrepreneurship ecology is under construction. But it can't just be government. The role of regulators is key, and I'd like to just set regulators as apart from government, because the regulators must implement to a policy that is fair for everyone. They can't take dictate from government. They must work for the welfare of the sector and for the welfare of the consumer. And in looking at that, I despair that the quality of regulators in our country is one which is not where it needs to be. And they sit between government and industry and entrepreneurship, and it's going to be important for us to ensure that the caliber and quality there is one which is fair and above board.
Great. Okay, we'll take questions. The volunteers will be around. The gentleman there was the first to put his hand up. Please keep your questions brief so that we can field as many as possible. And yeah. And the next one to this gentleman in the third row. Sir, please. A mic there, a mic there.
I'm sorry if I may offend many. There's a general tendency on blaming the government, like if anything goes wrong. Don't you think I was visiting a friend last year in New Zealand, and I asked him that, why do you import things from China, why not from India? And he said, I don't trust the quality. So is there not is our hypocrisy not translating practically into poor quality, then shortcuts to success being seen, and there being no fixing of final liability of people who are not trustworthy?
Okay, so Indian entrepreneurs are not producing goods of quality. Would anybody like to take that question? Ambi?
I think the question he asked was a tough one. He says private sector in India tends to blame all the problems onto government and now to regulators, right? So it's a tough question to answer. I don't have an answer to that. Probably we do. Probably we do blame the politicians for all our problems. We do blame the government for all our problems. We do now blame the regulators for all our problems. But what he's saying is, shouldn't the private sector...
We have pretty bad entrepreneurs as well. Fair enough. Yeah, Tarun?
Right. No, I mean, you know, my view on this is pretty simple, maybe even simple-minded, which is, you know, we get what we deserve, which is we've elected certain people, and we've acquiesced in a democratic society to the quality of our institutions. And I take a pretty strong point of view in the book saying that ultimately, you know, the fault is ours. As would-be creative individuals trying to do something good for our own space, we should take responsibility and try to correct the situation in our immediate ambience, and hopefully that aggregates over time. It's an idealistic position, so...
can we have a mic here? Oh, he already has a mic.
Yeah, I might be an outlier in this audience and in this country, but I have deep respect for the finance industry. I think they're heroes of our modern economy. And in that context, I was intrigued by a distinction that Mihir made between value creation and value extraction. And I would love if you could concretize that for me with an example, because in my head, I can't.
Sure. I mean, in some sense, the value creation in finance is the unsexy part of finance. It's insurance, which deals with the very hard problem of risks in our lives. It's basic lending. That's real value creation, because you're bridging, as you understand well, people with capital with people who need capital, which is a very difficult problem in a world where information is not widely shared. The value extraction piece is, I think, becoming more and more interesting and important. And that, I think, in the US setting and in the Western setting, is largely in the money management industry, where, especially with the growth of alternative assets, we see large extraction of fees with no associated value creation. And that, in the last 30 years, in my next book is going to be about the rise of investor capitalism, is the hallmark of the last 30 years, which is we have promoted investors to the top of the hierarchy, yet it's highly unclear whether they're adding any value. And they're extracting very large chunks of rents. And so that, I think, is the distinction. The unsexy part of finance is a lot of value creation.
And in a sense, this is very timely to the recent death of John Bogle, who illustrated that people don't create very much.
Exactly.
And they would have been a lot better off by investing in passive funds.
I just want to say one quick thing about this other comment, which is, in a way, the puzzle is, in a trust deficit society, Tarun, you'd expect the premia to people who behave trustworthy in a trustworthy way to be high. And so in a way, the question is, why don't we see large firms, which we haven't talked about as much, who are garnering the rewards from being trustworthy and getting that premium? Why don't we see that more?
But they do. If you look at the way stock markets reward trustworthy companies, you are more likely to see a higher multiple according to a company which has lived up to that trust, which provides a quality service, which respects its customers and works well in the environment to have that advantage. But I wanted to come in on the value creation piece of finance, which is critical. And finance can lead into areas which otherwise would not develop. And one of those, for example, would be what we would do going forward in everything to do with the green areas of finance. And if you look at solar when it started, it was seen as a very risky business. And the interventions that happened from insurance, from credit enhancement type of products, which enabled mainstream finance to follow, were critical to create today what is a mainstream industry which will provide a lot of jobs. So that intervention, or even venture capital, when it helps that entrepreneur who can't otherwise raise money. So the value creation space of finance is key because it de-risks what otherwise would not see mainstream finance.
We're all votaries of it. Yeah, we have time for a last question. So please. Yeah.
Hello. So in a trust deficit society like ours, we hear about a lot of cases from of promoters going Ori and so on and so forth. But not much has been heard about chartered accountants and the auditors of those companies in all these companies, everybody here must have heard of one or two promoters who have siphoned off money or done something
so
wrong.
did the chartered accountants play their role? Naina, you would be the best person to answer this.
Well, clearly not. If you think about how many companies we then hear had a big black hole. I would just make the distinction, though, between fraud, which is not easy to pick up. The role of an auditor is to go in and audit the financials. It's not to dive into the forensics of a company. So the distinction, which I don't think we make in India, so if you sit on the board of a company, there is no way you will know about a fraud that is happening down there. As in case, even in the Nirav Modi affair, the board may have been left entirely oblivious of what was actually happening at a core, because it was happening at a level where people were very smart.
But then I think the
able to
question is
hide
a
it.
slightly different one, which is that have chartered accountancy firms connived at the fudging
No,
of books?
I don't believe that they connived. Even in Satyam, it was clear there was certainly issues around proficiency, ability. Should they have dug deeper? Should they have asked for more? Did they trust too much in that big company, Satyam, because they didn't believe there was wrong? Should they have done another level of check? But conniving, no.
Okay, great.
So, but efficiency and ability to find those loopholes and not trust
Errors of commission versus errors of omission, right?
Yeah, sure. This has been most fascinating panel. Thank you so much, Mihir, Naina, Tarun, and Ambi. Thank you all for being a wonderful audience.
Thank you.